Hello, my name is Dr. Simon Smith. I'm Associate Professor of Security and International Relations here at Staffordshire University. And today I'm going to be doing this masterclass webinar on Trump, NATO, and European security. If you've been following the news in the last couple of years, you might notice there's been a bit of acrimony and tension between European allies. As you can see from this picture, they don't always see eye to eye, or in fact, might not be looking, have the same visions of the world at all. Harry Kissinger lately has given a great quote that sort of shows Trump as this enigmatic figure. It's sometimes hard to tell. Is he the start of a new beginning or the end of an old one? But I think it's clear that there's an understanding that it might not be status quo when it comes to international relations more broadly, or European security and European cooperation specifically. And so he is that figure at the end, maybe that is showing that things are not the same as they used to be. And so we think about a Cold War era into a post-Cold War era, and now maybe a post-Trump era. So if you're on Twitter or have, again, been following the news, you'll know that President Donald Trump is quite a fan of using this platform. And so here, this is clearly not all his tweets, not even on this subject, but here are a few I thought would demonstrate his sort of approach, his rhetoric to NATO and to his European allies. And so what I've chosen are a few here right before the NATO summit last summer, where he kind of shows or he tries to use that divisive rhetoric that the allies aren't paying enough, that they're not spending their commitment and not being fair partners within NATO, that they should pay more. And you can see his use of caps there, and we should pay less. And that NATO, as you can see, as that moves forward to the end of July there, then he starts to talk about how he was victorious and convincing or browbeating his European partners into spending more, billions more, even if this was already happening before. And so you can see there, I've had a great meeting with my NATO allies, and now they're going to spend much more after I've told them to do so. He's also attacked Macron of France and in the this idea of a European autonomous project, or sometimes heard of as known as a European army, which is a bit of an illusion, but this European autonomous project now that, if from the Europeans' point of view, they might not be as put as much trust in Trump, and so therefore thinking, do we have to do this more on our own, and we have to think of the long-term situation. And again, these tweets really kind of show that bitterness and how he seems to approach that. So let's look a bit more at the kind of broader level that this is all resting on, as well as Trump's own politics and how this all ties together. So if we think about this in terms of a return to geopolitics, okay, we can think about that in the European context, what's happening within Europe, but we can also think of this as the global context, and of course the American or the US approach to both. So what we're actually seeing here is a return to geopolitics within Europe. After the Cold War, that certainly died down quite a bit for the first 20 years. But since 2014, we've had a so-called resurgence from Russia trying to establish itself again in Europe and on the global stage. At the same time, the US was trying to pivot away from Europe and focus on a rising China in the East. And so all of this is going on at the same time is the additional acrimony or distrust between the Europeans and Trump. So let's look at this in terms of Trump, his own foreign policy, his sort of idea and vision of the world, the traditional foreign policy of the U.S. approach, and how Trump connects to his base. And when you want to think about Trump politics at the international level, then you always have to remember he's primarily speaking to his base at home. So if we look at this in relation to the broader agenda of the administration, or one camp within the administration, what we might call the anti-institutionalist. And so when Trump came to power, he found it very hard to find a foreign policy community, the traditional foreign policy community, that really identified with his vision. They weren't quite sure if this was rhetoric on the campaign trail, and then business would be business, back to the usual sort of traditional American approach. But clearly, it didn't take long to see that that wasn't going to be the case. And so there is a fight within the administration for these anti-institutionalists, people that don't really trust these types of large organizations or doing multilateral approaches to foreign policy. If we can't, within this camp of the Trump administration, if you can't pull out of some of these organizations, and I'd put NATO into that basket, then we want to weaken them maybe as well, because again, there's a high skepticism of them. John Bolton is also a kind of key thinker in this part of the administration, in this wing of the administration. And it's connected to this radical understanding of liberty, which means really that you can only depend on yourself, and anytime you're reliant on someone outside of your borders, including even allies, but certainly states around the world, as well as some of these global institutions, then there really becomes this antipathy towards them, low levels of trust in them, and disregard, really. And this is also connected to this idea of nationalism, which you've probably heard in terms of America First type approach. This has a knock-on effect of not really having much in the way of consultation, and consultation can be bilateral with your colleague, with your European counterparts, inviting them to the White House or on visits to Europe, or it can be through some of these multilateral organizations on the sidelines, or even directly within them, things like NATO, the European Union, the G7 or G20, which is coming up. But the Europeans don't really feel like they've been consulted on this, and if you think about it, this is wider than European security. They haven't been consulted on pulling out of the Paris Climate Agreement. They haven't been consulted in pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, and you can think of other examples as well. And again, this really ties into Trump and his base. And so the people who he's talking to, the people who identify with his understanding of global politics are fine with that. And so he's really sort of, as long as these people are going to support this sort of sledgehammer approach or divisive approach to cooperative security and cooperative negotiations and multilateral institutions, then he'll continue to do so. The real question is, how far will he go? On some of his campaign promises and post-administration policy, they've lined up. Pulling out of the Iranian deal, pulling out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. NATO is a bit different. The language on the campaign trail was about that NATO was obsolete, but clearly the U.S. has not pulled out of NATO to date, and I'll come back to that in a minute. So what has been the impact of this acrimony? Well, one argument is to say you have to look at the policy and not the rhetoric. So the rhetoric can get you so far. It gives you an understanding of Trump's maybe vision or how he sees allies more instrumentally than it would normally be the case in other administrations. But it doesn't actually show you what the ultimate policy was. And so if you looked at the campaign rhetoric towards NATO, then by now NATO should have been folded up and put in the dustbin of history. But that is clearly not the case. In fact, Mike Pompeo, the U.S. Secretary of State, went before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and said, he didn't say this in the exact words, but if you read between the lines, said, pay no attention to what Trump says, but look at what we do. And again, I think if you look to European security and transatlantic security, this has been the case. And so, to a large extent, Trump is constrained by larger U.S. strategic foreign policy goals, normally identified as primacy, active engagement through these institutions with partners, with alliances. And so, although Trump has a sort of his core is not someone that trusts these or doesn't look to use these as primary policy tools to achieve strategic goals. The foreign policy establishment, by and large, does believe in that. And so it's very hard for Trump to find people, regardless of this battle within the administration, to find people in the wider foreign policy community that really identify with his worldview and want to carry out some of these policies. And so that brings us to a nice picture that kind of shows this two ways of looking at this. This was in the last G7 summit, and this picture, it can be read as two ways. It can be read as partners and allies standing up to Trump, trying to convince him of their way to have multilateral approaches, that you're being divisive, you're eroding alliances, or it can be read the opposite of Trump standing up and saying, I don't mind being alienated on this. It's America first. You can say all you want, but that's the way it is. And so, of course, both camps did play this picture up that way, but I thought it was an interesting way to look at that. Is it transatlantic security, European and U.S. cooperation and security, I think can be spun in a positive or negative way, depending on how you want to approach that. And before the last NATO summit, everyone, including myself, was wondering, how is this going to play out? Was Trump going to play the negative card? Or could he come around, try to get concessions on allies paying more, but essentially play a positive role? So let's quickly look at some of those aspects if we want to break them down to sort of the negative and the positive. So on the negative side, yes, there is deep discord between the allies and the Trump administration at the moment. They have clearly different worldviews and different approaches to this. Trump rhetoric was about NATO being obsolete on the campaign trail, has still been quite, through his tweets, as I said, has attacked this. There's low levels of trust on both sides. They're not getting together to consult each other on big ticket policy and strategic goals. And there is an imbalance in what we call burden sharing. The allies pay far less than the U.S. does into the NATO, well, not into a NATO budget, but into their own defense budgets that help create a more fair and balanced burden sharing within NATO. On the positive side, and Trump's taken a lot of credit for this, but it began before Trump, even Obama, and this goes back, this goes back to the Cold War, really. But the allies have started to spend more on their own defense. Only 5 of the NATO members spent the allocated 2% of GDP on defense. And within the last few years, they've increased that. I think we're up to about 8, and some are still reluctant or slow to do that, Germany in particular. But clearly they are spending more. Now, I think that has much more to do with a resurgent Russia and a threat of Russia than it does with Trump's browbeating, but it's still a positive. And of course, they are happy to let Trump take the credit for that. And so for all the allies, NATO remains indispensable, and there is no real challenge to it as such. And Article 5, attack on one is attack on all, is still at the center of that institution. It's been around for 70 years, which is quite a long time for any alliance. Usually they last about 12 years, so that is something considerable in itself. And it has been, since 2014, really enhancing its deterrence posture, building up its defenses, both to the east and to the south, where the NATO allies see different threats emerging. So what are the long-term options here, really? Well, one is maybe if the U.S. is generally disinterested and even going as far as pulling out of NATO, then maybe there needs to be a renewed Franco-German axis that could be through the European Union or even just bilaterally, that helps to start a trend of more deep engagement in autonomous European security and defense action. Or that could go the other way. The Germans are a big state, but they due to historical reasons and domestic politics, it's hard for them to use force or talk about the use of force when talking about international relations. But the French don't have, or neither do the UK, have such problems with doing so. So maybe having the 2 biggest military actors in Europe can have a sort of French connection that can see a bilateral approach to European security. Or there could be, and again, the Brexit issue comes into this, but there could be further integration in the field of EU security through the European Union. And so, again, probably relying on that Franco-German axis, this could be done through integration in pursuit of strategic autonomy within the European Union. Finally, penultimately, you could have a role for the UK, who is now Brexiting the European Union. So it's going to see NATO as its fundamental, it always has, but now it's only as well security organization in Europe. And so it really needs to double down on that, try to maybe get the Europeans to have, instead of doing it through the EU, have a European caucus within NATO that keeps NATO the primary instrument of European security, keeps the US interested and the Europeans involved as well. And therefore, the UK has more oversight than it would if this was done through the European Union. This could also lead to a broadening role for NATO and also its partnership with the European Union, a kind of division of labor between NATO, what NATO is good at, hard security, and the European Union doing soft security, small crisis management, and sort of civilian and civilian type missions around the world. So this would still be European led. It would have a caucus within NATO, but it would also have a European Union dimension to it as well. I think we'll have to wait and see. You may have noticed in the news from last summer at the last NATO summit that when Trump met, he pushed his Montenegrin colleague, President of Montenegro, out the way to get to the front of the line to be in that photo op. And I think we're looking at another at least 2 more years, maybe even 6, of this acrimony, of this distrust between them, while still maintaining the underlying principles of the alliance. And it's going to be at least till that before we can get to friends again and a real strong, robust transatlantic relationship. Thank you.